Hi, welcome to the Audit Leaders webinar on ethics. I'm Sandwith and I'm the Chartered Institute of Internal Auditors Chief Professional Practice Advisor. A couple of things I'd like to mention first, logistics if you like. Please may I ask you all, if you have any questions, to add them to our Q&A box as we go through the event. And I'll try and ensure that we have 10-15 minutes perhaps towards the end of the hour to answer any questions. That will be helpful. Please don't put them in the chat box because that's not so easy to track. I hope you can all hear and see the screen, and also to remember for your team that we are recording this and it will be posted on Audit Leaders' website, and you will then be able to replay it, perhaps as part of a team meeting. Ethics is very important for internal auditors as a profession, but particularly this year and moving forward, because when we're thinking about continual professional education, ethics is a topic area where we have to be able to demonstrate we have 2 hours of CPE when we submit our CPEs at the end of the year. So bear that in mind if you would, please. What I want to think about today is I want to think about ethics, but not as a standalone. I want to think about ethics linked to culture, values, and trust as we go through the session. The IIA Code of Ethics, in terms of appreciating that organisations have codes of ethics, as do we as an institute, a profession. So we need to think about that. And so, for example, one of the questions I would ask is it included in your audit charter? So let's think about some of these things as we go through the session. So, first, Code of Ethics. A code of ethics is about, and values can be helpful as part of a framework for embedding the importance of trust and integrity across the organisation, and I feel certain we would all agree with that. A code can assist in communications, expectations and standards of behaviour. Individuals can refer to it for guidance, and it can also be held, and individuals can also be held accountable against it. But most important of all, the Code of Ethics needs to be achievable, enforceable, and enforced. And I think the last word there is something that we really need to bear in mind as we go through this. So my agenda is going to look a bit like this. How do we define ethics? Think about some corporate governance failures. Remember the IPPF Code of Ethics. I've got a little mnemonic ethics that will perhaps help us keep our focus on some of the key things. Think about how it helps us gain insight. I want to look at ethics and values. I want to look at ethics and trust, ethics and culture, give you some closing thoughts, and I've got some super quotes that I think might be interesting for you, and then we'll deal with Q&A. So, how do we define ethics? Perhaps that's a good way to start. It's about actions and decisions. It's about behaviour. It's one of those things that I think is sometimes quite difficult to touch. So if we were going to audit ethics in our organisation, that's going to be talking to people, seeing how people behave, what documentation, policies, procedures support their behaviour. It's not like an accounts payable audit where we will have a whole raft of documents that we can look at, and, you know, to wind the clock back, as you probably all know, I'm a mature lady, wind the clock back, tick with an orange pen, which used to be the case when I first started. So it's very different, is this. The other thing we need to remember is, as institute members, if you breach your Code of Ethics, which you sign up to every year when you renew your membership of the Institute, and that applies if your organisation renews your membership, and perhaps you don't even realise it's happened, you have still signed up to adhere to the Code of Ethics. And if you breach, the Institute has disciplinary procedures, and your behaviour will be investigated, explored, and a decision will be reached as to whether or not you have behaved appropriately. So it's important, and we need to bear that in mind. So I've got a little diagram here that puts culture at the heart of everything that we do. And if you read the quality press, if you listen to some of the experts in our world, some of our colleagues, chief audit execs, those sort of people, they will tell you that culture is often the root cause of organisations that have failed. But making up culture, in my thinking, as we go through this hour, is ethics, so how people behave, values, what people want to embrace, and trust. So that's trust for each other with an internal audit function, trust within the organisation, and trust of your customers, your organisation's customers and internal audit customers, in terms of how you behave and whether or not your behaviour is appropriate. When I was the head of audit, I was talking to our CEO at one point, and he was saying to me, Liz, I think you're making this all a bit complicated. His view was it's as simple as A, B, C. You need the right attitude, i.e. you need the attitude that embraces ethics, understands their importance. You need the right behaviours linked to values, and most importantly, we need to know there are consequences. So if you breach ethics, if you fail to value the values of the organisation, and if you don't embrace the culture of the organisation, then there should be consequences for us as individuals, but also consequences for the organisation. And that might be consequences in the form of an internal audit that is very critical about the organisation's ethical culture, or it could be consequences for individual members. So if you see some of the corporate governance failures, and the list is fairly endless as we go down that, some recent ones, Patisserie Valerie, Barclays CEO wanting to find out who a whistleblower was, and call me cynical, but I don't think it was to say thank you for highlighting that issue. He had concerns and wanted perhaps to stop the allegation being investigated. We have the Oxfam, we know about Carillion, the list is endless. And I think if we look at some of those and we think, is it partly the tone of the top, the philosophy and operating style of senior management? That's not just the CEO, but your senior management team and your senior managers in each of the business functions, subsidiaries, and also think about your suppliers, your third parties. Are we comfortable that they also have integrity and ethical values as part of how they behave? Because their breaches or their bad press, as it were, will also impact on us. So we need to bear that in mind. So reasons, as I said, ethical values, culture, the wrong culture, things like the Wells Fargo, if you remember, where they were giving, staff were given incentives to open new accounts, so they created fictitious accounts to derive the incentives, so the incentives were driving the wrong behaviour, lack of honesty, people not being honest, and that may be when you undertake an audit, any audit. How do you know that the people you are talking to are being honest with you? And that might be, and we will explore this a bit later on, that might be because they're frightened. There's a fear, a culture of fear, and that might impact on their ability to be honest. And then the common things, greed, fraudulent activity, the FD at Patisserie Valerie, and incompetent management. So we need to think about those as we go through today. So just as a quick reminder, I'm sure you're all sitting here thinking, oh gosh, we know all these, but the IIA Code of Ethics, 4 elements: integrity, objectivity, confidentiality, and competence. And we're going to explore some of those as we go through this morning. So, the Code of Ethics, it says there, and hopefully as members you will all know this, so this is just a quick refresh. The Code of Ethics provide principles and rules of conduct relating to integrity, objectivity. Remember, and it says there, so you can reflect, internal audits have to exhibit the highest level of professional objectivity. And by that we mean, and don't forget, that our standards clearly tell us that you shouldn't audit an area that you have worked in for at least 12 months. We have to be objective when we gather our information, so we have to take that into account. Confidentiality. Respect people's confidences that they share with you, but be clear, you can't keep a confidence if it's going to damage the organisation, if it is something so significant that it needs to be investigated further. So, as it says there, there's a legal or professional obligation to share that information. And competency. Do we have the knowledge, the skills and experience needed to do our job? And if not, what do we need to do to improve that? So Code of Ethics really embraces all of the things that we need to think about as professional internal auditors. I found this diagram. It was part of a Managing Culture, a Good Practice Guide. And I quite liked it because I thought it was quite clear in terms of the board's responsibility. Number one, establishes ethical framework, sets the tone from the top. Senior management team, implementation and monitoring of desired culture, leadership of ethical framework and culture. So one of the things that we will see in our organisations as internal auditors is if the tone from the top is flawed, if senior managers do not lead by example, that cascades through the organisation and causes problems, causes organisations to fail. And we as internal audit, as you can see there, need to link into our risk colleagues and our HR colleagues to make sure that we're all looking at this from a similar perspective. So think about this diagram. I think it's quite a good one in terms of helping you think about what needs to happen. So moving on, I told you I had a mnemonic for you. I can't claim lots of ingenuity here or originality. The word is ethics, and the source was Lynn Fountain, a risk consultant trainer. E stands for everyone is responsible. So you will have heard that language innumerable times, I'm sure, in your organisations in relation to things like health and safety, in relation to risk. It's everyone's responsibility, the 4 eyes principle. 4 eyes are better than 2 at looking at things. That's the same with ethics. And certainly, I travel on trains a lot, and those of you that do as well will have heard at railway stations now, trains, they have this see it, say it, sorted message, which is making every passenger responsible for reporting things that they see that are inappropriate. So everyone is responsible. The T, tone at the top, absolutely essential. If your senior management team, as I've just said, or your CEO, or your chair are not sending out the right messages, then the staff in the organisation, the employees of the organisation, will follow bad practice, and that will cascade through. Honesty is the best policy. I'm sure we can all remember our parents, mine especially, I can remember them saying to me before they went to a parents' evening, you have told us everything, Liz, teachers aren't going to surprise us. And I always used to say, yes, Mum, yes, Dad, I have. And I probably hadn't. I hadn't told them that I'd been late with my homework a couple of times. Hadn't told them that, you know, I think it was always my maths teacher was a bit fed up with me. I didn't do very well in tests. I didn't share that. And then I got into trouble when they came home. Integrity is a must. It's who we are. And don't forget, this also embraces things like illegal activities. So if you know your organisation is behaving illegally, then you have a responsibility under our Code of Ethics to call that out. Corporate social responsibility, that's linking in to the message again that links to the top about everyone is responsible. What is your organisation doing? And this isn't good enough just to have words on a page. This is something that we have to live and believe. And if you remember, a few years ago, one of the big banks out at Canary Wharf in London made a big thing about, being environmentally friendly, and they were switching off all the lights, and they had messages on all light switches, and a journalist walked around Canary Wharf at something like 2 o'clock in the morning and said it was lit up like a Christmas tree, and they had to then backpedal a bit and say, oh yes, well we had cleaners in or decorators in or whatever. But you have to make sure the words you say to your customers, your stakeholders, can be supported. And silence isn't acceptable, and we'll look at that in a moment. And this is both the sin of commission, so deliberately keeping silent, but also the sin of omission, not saying something because perhaps you are frightened or apprehensive about the repercussions. So we need to bear those things in mind as we go through. So why is it important to us as professional internal auditors? Because people have to trust us as internal auditors to do a good job, to do what we have said, what is in our charter, what we have promised the audit committee and the board in relation to the level of assurance. And that isn't just, yes, all of the invoices were paid promptly, or all of the invoices were correct, or the payroll was correct. It's about the culture of the organisation that drives the right behaviours. So customers can trust your organisation to deliver the right thing. And that is one of the things that as internal audit we need to be aware of in terms of the ethics. But it's not new for us. We've known about this for many years. I've been a member of the Institute since '88, and Code of Ethics has been there all of that time. So it isn't something new, but I think it's something we need to shout more about. And so we're going to think about that as we go through the slides. So as I said, everyone's responsibility. People use ethics a lot. They throw it into conversations. It's always a bit like regulators. Sometimes, if internal audit's identified a particular issue, sometimes management, if they don't want to embrace it, will say, oh, well, the regulator won't let us do that. They don't know whether the regulator will or not, but they think that will put us off. And I think that's also what happens a little bit with the word ethics. It tends to be used to say, well, of course, you can trust my team. They're very ethical. They have strong integrity. Therefore, don't look too closely because you don't need to. You can trust us to do the right thing. And, as the third bullet point says, we have to be committed. Every single employee in your organisation has to be committed to ethical behaviour if your organisation is going to be successful. I would challenge you to identify a hugely successful organisation that doesn't have a strong ethical culture, because I think we would struggle to find them. I can't think of one offhand, so I think we will struggle to find one because it is so important. And we also need to think about how it links in with our control environment, because if you think about it, if people have, strong ethical values, a strong culture in the organisation, then they should all be doing the right thing, which, from our perspective as internal audit, should make our job a lot easier. So, it's a bit like a mature risk culture, a mature control environment. If you have a mature ethical culture in your organisation, all of those things indicate that the organisation is doing the right thing, which helps us as internal auditors. So we need to bear that in mind as we go through. So, tone at the top, I've told you about, what your CEO says. I used to work some years ago for an organisation where the CEO used to talk about expenses. Everybody seemed to talk about expenses for a period of time, and it was very much about, you can't submit an expense claim if you haven't got receipts, and if you do, don't expect to be paid because you won't. But he did, and he got paid. And therefore, the message gets round, actually, don't listen to what your CEO says because he does something different. That sets the wrong tone from the top, because then people complain, well, the CEO gets paid, why don't I get paid? And it's divisive and demotivating, and it causes dysfunctional behaviour in the organisation. So your CEO, your senior management team, your chair must communicate frequently, openly and honestly what's going on within the organisation and how their behaviour influences the organisation, what their beliefs are, what is important to them, so that the employees in the organisation can understand the roles and responsibilities and why ethics is important. So after tone at the top, we then look at honesty. I've already said a bit about this. Ethics and corporate responsibility don't necessarily equate to honesty. I think we've probably seen that with some of the organisations that have failed. Probably thought they had a good ethical culture, very clear about their corporate responsibility. But if you're not honest, if you don't have honesty in the workplace, then it fails. Patisserie Valerie, perfect example of that. And the second bullet point here is really quite important, I think, because it's about an admission of either wrongdoing, poor judgment, or an honest mistake. We all make mistakes. There is nothing wrong with saying, I made a mistake there, or I made a judgment because of something, and subsequently, that was the wrong judgment. Hindsight is a phenomenal tool. Unfortunately, we only get it after the event has occurred. Therefore, we can't use that as a tool to help us not make the wrong judgment decision or not make a mistake. So we need to be clear about why honesty is important in our organisation. And it can be a dilemma when we're a head of internal audit or when we are an internal auditor, because we're going to be put on the spot of calling out gaps that we see in organisations, instances where honesty hasn't been the word for the day, and where things have been wrong for a long time, and we identify it and we have to call it out. And that takes courage from us as internal auditors, and we have to be very clear what it means both to us as internal audit and also to our organisation. And remember our code of ethics and why it's important that we do the right thing. So integrity. Integrity can be measured by ethics here. So I was thinking when I was putting these slides together, if you had to name the top 3 people in history that you felt displayed unquestionable integrity, would those be the same ones that you would rate highly on the ethics scale? Hopefully they would, but not necessarily. Because integrity is about adherence to moral code, reflected in honesty and harmony. Ethics is about a set of morals, if you like, as well, in terms of how people behave. So ethics is more about behaviour. So when you think about your leadership team, your CEO, chair of your audit committee, would those people be names that you would have on your list? In terms of, I know they're not part of history, but in terms of people you felt displayed unquestionable integrity and strong ethical values. So those are the people that we want our employees in the organisation to emulate. Those are the people that we seek to emulate. And my father, when I was growing up, was always very clear to me that one of the key things you needed to do, and I think this is really true of internal auditors, is look in the mirror at the end of every day and think about whether or not you've done the right things today. Have you behaved in the right way? Have you honoured the values of your organisation? Have you honoured your code of ethics as an internal auditor? And have you got the right culture in place? And have you called out where you've seen things that are wrong? So maybe that's something we ought to do more, that looking in the mirror and challenging ourselves, because we have to be brave to do that as well. Corporate social responsibility, owned by all of us, every employee in your organisation. So it could be recycling, it could be community causes. So I know some organisations, the various functions have a day a year where they go and do things for the community. So that could be working on a community farm or a garden or a vegetable plot. And that could be also about providing feedback. Do you, as internal audit, provide feedback to your senior managers, your management team, areas where you have been involved as auditors in terms of how they've behaved, how they could make the business better? And some of that's probably about sharing best practice, and have they taken on board what you've said? So let's think about some of that as we go through the slides. Think about what we could do. So hopefully all of you have a whistleblowing policy. I'm very much against the name, but I've used that because everybody will immediately resonate with it. I think that's quite a negative term. It tends to imply people are telling tales on people. I think speak up is much more positive. It talks to, the words alone, talk to the fact that you're working for the best of the organisation. So encouraging a speak up policy is something that I think is really important. But, as I say here, have you done an audit of your speak-up policy? Have you looked to see how well it's embraced in the organisation? I worked for an organisation of over 100,000 employees, and when my internal audit team looked at, then it was the whistleblowing policy, in the course of a 12-month period, we'd had 4 whistleblowing allegations made. Now, on the law of averages, that just didn't feel right to me, because I knew, based on audits we'd done, I knew there were areas of concern. I knew there were staff who had concerns about the behaviour of the organisation. So I knew that was wrong, and we contributed as internal audit to changing the name from whistleblowing to speak up, and that generated then a lot more support from our employees in terms of calling out things that they saw that were wrong, that were inappropriate, but didn't carry that telling tales. So if you have a hotline, and this is interesting because I worked for a company owned by a German company, and I tried the hotline to see what it was, how it worked, because I was doing an audit in this space. I dialed the number, and a German lawyer answered, who spoke no English, and my German is okay in terms of hello, how are you, but nothing more than that. So they were ticking the box with yes, they've got an anonymous hotline where people can raise concerns, but actually you couldn't do it unless you spoke German, because the hotline was manned by a German lawyer. So, you know, if you're doing audits in this space, don't forget that, because speak up is so important to us, and we need to think about that as we go through. And it will flag things for us. Freedom to raise concerns without retribution. Remember the Barclays example I gave you at the beginning, where the CEO was trying to hunt is a bit strong, trying to locate and identify somebody who had blown the whistle about a particular issue. And if you recall, some years ago, one of the banks were also in trouble for paying off to silence a whistleblower. So they terminated their employment, given them a large check, and told them to keep quiet about an issue that they'd identified. The individual didn't, he called out, but nevertheless, the organisation had behaved inappropriately. So fear of retaliation is a real issue that we need as internal audit to appreciate. So, gaining insight. How does ethics help us gain insight in terms of evaluating programs? I think there are a number of ways that we as heads of internal audit can look at this. So we could think about, do we do an audit of ethical behaviour in the organisation? Could we do an audit of ethical culture and link that into an overarching program of work around the culture of the organisation? Do we do that by going and talking to someone and saying, so what do you think about the ethics in the organisation? Or do we need to think outside the box a bit? Think about procedures that are relevant. Think about how people behave. Identify, as you do all of your audits across your year, where you see instances of inappropriate behaviour, inappropriate performance by staff, senior management, that demonstrate that they're not signed up to the ethical values of the organisation, the values that our HR teams will share with us in terms of driving the right behaviours in the organisation. And that ultimately will probably indicate to you that there's an issue around culture. So you might well find that you've got a board who thinks they have a blame-free culture across their organisation. Everyone is free to speak. But then you're doing an audit in sales, perhaps, and you hear a manager maybe shout across the office to somebody about their behaviour and it's all your fault and you shouldn't have done that and I told you not to do that and now you'll have to correct it. So that's not a blame culture, is it? I was talking to a head of audit quite recently who said their CEO was big on my door is always open. You can talk to me about anything, anytime. And he said, you try and get in his diary. And he said, maybe you'll get an appointment by June 2023, if you're lucky. So be careful of words here, which is why I think you need to move away from a checklist approach. You need, I'm not a fan of surveys in this topic. I think we need to sit down, we need to talk to people, and we need to understand what they believe are the ethical behaviours, the values, and the culture of the organisation that then enable us to challenge them or to question them if we are unclear why they have a particular thought pattern or why they are making particular statements. So for me, these are very much helping us, this sort of an audit or work in this space is helping us really understand how the organisation operates, what sits behind the goals and objectives, what sits behind, the objectives about increased sales 5% year on year, or improve EBITDA, or whatever the financial goals might be. This is very much about the heart of the organisation. So I said to you I was going to look at ethics and values and how they sit together. And I think it's good that we understand that they're different, because ethics are a set of rules that govern behaviour, and values are more around beliefs that have an enduring preference. So you, as individuals, will have to follow the rules, if you like, in relation to the IIA Code of Ethics, if you are a member of the Institute. Your organisation may also have a code of ethics, but your organisation will most certainly, I'm so sure, have values. You'll probably see them in reception, you'll certainly see them outside or along the corridors near the HR office, and they will be language that talks about what your organisation wants to do, what some of its preferences are in terms of how it treats people. So they're both very important, but we have to sometimes make a choice. Ethics determine what is right, and values determine what is important. So remember I mentioned to you earlier about illegal activities in an organisation, and that could be things that might lead to a breach. So give you an example. Our ethics talk about not working with your organisation to behave illegally. Now that could be a regulatory breach, because there will be sanctions for that, there are rules, and therefore breaching those is a significant issue. So I work for a financial services organisation that sold insurance, and they sold it in South America, and they sold it offshore. And the rules in the country were very much that you had to sell through an agent in the country. You couldn't sell offshore. Having said that, the organisation generated between 500 and 600 million a year in profit from this business, and the regulator in this country had acted once in the last 5 years, and the fine had been $1 million. So the values of the organisation were to drive the profits, drive the sustainability, be an organisation that's here for a long time to come, and support customers. So they continued to do that business, even though internal audit has highlighted that it was a regulatory breach and therefore technically illegal. They had said, fine, thank you for that internal audit, but from a value perspective, this is important to us as it drives the success of the organisation. So we need to be able, as internal auditors, to understand the difference between what is right and what is important. And sometimes they may conflict, but we need to understand what that is and what it looks like, and then call out if we're concerned. So here's a little table that gives us some comparisons between the two. So if you look at the meaning, ethics refers to guidelines for conduct that address questions about morality. Values, principles and ideals help you make judgment about, as we said earlier, what is important or what is more important. So ethics, they are a system of moral principles. People tend to talk about the moral fibre of an organisation. Values, stimuli for thinking. Ethics have to be uniform. Values differ from person to person. So within your organisation, I am hopeful that you will have a code of conduct for all staff that they sign up to when they join, and within that code of conduct will be an ethical statement about what your organisation believes in terms of its morality and how it behaves. Some of the tells in relation to ethics, it's what is morally correct or incorrect, and then being clear and how you behave. Values, what we'd like to achieve, our goals, our aspirations, our hopes for the future. And it determines ethics, rightness or wrongness, and values are about levels of importance. Ethics constrains, values motivate. And that, again, is something we as internal auditors need to really think about, because those two also can conflict. Because if the ethics in an organisation was perhaps stronger than the values, then you might find that you have a culture that constrains individuals. That could be creatively, in terms of moving the organisation forward. So we need the two. They need to sit side by side to help us. And then if we think about the difference, and we've just talked about that really, ethics and values. Ethics refer to guidelines for conduct. Ethics are a system of moral principles. Values influence the emotional state of mind. Ethics are consistent. Values tell us what we want to do or achieve in our life. So personally, I'm sure you all have values. Values about what you see your career being, how you are moving forward in your career as internal auditors. You know, do you ultimately want to be chief audit exec at some very large organisation? Unless you already are when you're on the phone, on the call, perhaps with a team of 650 staff, 2,000 staff. You know, how big is your value aspirations? But ethics tell us what's right. Ethics ground us in terms of our behaviour. And I think that for me, one of the most important things about ethics that sits very much with internal audit is they provide an assurance to our customers across your organisation that whether it's Liz, Bob, Mary, Fred doing an audit, they will get the same level of behaviour, the same reliance on confidentiality, on competence and objectivity, whichever one of us is doing it. And that's very important for our customers to be able to trust internal audit in that way. And then we're going to think about the new FRC code that was issued in July last year, and it talks here in that code about board effectiveness. And one of the questions for boards to ask management, so this is your senior management team, your CEO, is what assurance is there that the code of conduct and ethics training programs are up to date? So is that something that you would include in an audit in the ethics space? Have we got a training program for ethics? Is it up to date? Are all staff required to do it? Do they just do it when they join? And then we've got Liz who's been in the organisation 30 years and hasn't done it since. Do we have a refresher program? How do we make sure that people are reminded what our ethics program is about and why it's important? And then there's another bullet point here about the signs of possible cultural problems. And I think this is quite a powerful one that we need to bear in mind, which is about the tolerance level. You know, is your organisation tolerant of regulatory breaches? So, you know, if your organisation knows it's not complying with GDPR, for example, are they okay with that? Or is there a real drive to try and get full conformance with legislation, whatever that legislation looks like? So it could be modern slavery, it could be gender pay reporting, it could be minimum wage, it could be any of those things. And is it equally tolerant of code of ethics breaches? So people not demonstrating integrity, people conducting perhaps illegal activities or inappropriate behaviours across your organisation. Are they tolerant of fraud? Are they tolerant of other behaviours that could, if it fell into the public domain, damage the reputation of your organisation? And if they are, what does that say about the culture of your organisation? And internal audit, do we have evidence that will help us provide the answers to management, audit committee and board in relation to these questions around ethics? If not, what are we thinking about? What are our plans for 2019-20 to enable us to answer some of those questions? So then if we look at trust, I don't know whether any of you look at the Edelman Trust Barometer, which is issued every year. And certainly trust has gone up a little bit this year. One of the interesting things that have come to light is that staff trust their organisations more. So employees trust their organisations more than they have done in the past. Your customers don't. Customers don't trust organisations. Trust, you know, in terms of how they'll behave, are they doing the right thing? They don't trust. So we're at really an all-time low in terms of trust from our customers, our stakeholders. So we need to think about that and link it to ethics. So, you know, I talk here about, you know, does the individual walk the talk? How does your organisation demonstrate on its advertising materials that the customers, the stakeholders can trust them? And if you remember a few years ago, Nike got into quite serious bother because they had a massive statement about they absolutely refused to use child labour at all in any country in terms of suppliers. And then a journalist found children in India as young as 5, I think, sewing the Nike tick on footballs. And suddenly, you know, their reputation was damaged because of that. They'd made a statement without the evidence to support it. So again, from our perspective, are we as internal audit looking at the words that are on all the material within the organisation? Are we calling the organisation to account if it's promising things that we believe it's not delivering? Are we auditing the advertising and marketing departments to make sure that although there is a degree of poetic license, they're not abusing it, such that if it came to light that it would damage the reputation of the organisation? So let's think about that wide thing. Think about audits maybe that we haven't done before. I'm thinking about sales and marketing. Well, not sales, advertising and marketing. Have we gone into that space? Have we challenged the words they use? So let's think about that as we reflect, or as you reflect on this morning's session. Think about what is in your plan for 1920. So we need to think also about ethics and culture. We talk a lot at the Institute about the importance of an audit of culture. And certainly a lot of feedback that I've received from heads of internal audit, from auditors, from chief audit execs is it's all right talking about that, but actually it's a really difficult audit to do, to look across your organisation and to form a view as to the culture of your organisation. It's not our place to say whether or not the organisation's culture is the right culture to deliver the goals and objectives. What we need to be thinking about is the culture set by the board cascaded through the organisation. And one of the little sort of tests I tend to do is, you may remember when you went to children's birthday parties and you used to sit in a circle and somebody would whisper in Liz's ear that Liz has had a nosebleed. And by the time it had gone round the entire circle, the message came back, Liz is in intensive care, she's had 2 blood transfusions, and she's unlikely to make it to the end of the day. That's because everybody's added their little bit, and this is exactly the same. So the board will have set a culture, and then every tier of management, as you go down there, that chain, will have added their element to that culture. And therefore, we need to be clear what is the culture at the coal face and what was the culture the board thought they had cascaded through the organisation, and how can we call out to the board, you know, it's okay you saying this is the culture, but you need to make sure that the culture that you set is the culture that cascades through the organisation. And I think one of the interesting things that might help boards, certainly FTSE 250s, is the new Code of Corporate Governance, because there is reference in there to having a voice from the workforce on the board. And that will be a good way of understanding whether the workforce hears the same message from board that board thinks it has given. And that will, I think, provide some interesting board discussions, and I'd certainly like to be a fly on the wall on some of those. So ethics culture, really important. And I wonder whether we can take it in bite-sized chunks, whether there is an ethics culture audit, a risk culture audit, and perhaps we can start bringing these together. Values culture audit. We can put values on the wall, but does anybody believe them? Are they following them? Do they understand the importance of them in their behaviours? And maybe by taking different bite-sized bits, we can end up being able to provide an assurance to our audit committee and board as to the culture within the organisation. So I think there are different ways that we can pick off this. I said I got some really good quotes for you, and I quite like some of these. I like the Ronald Reagan, trust but verify. I think that's almost our message, and maybe that's on the heart of all internal auditors. Yeah, we trust you. We're your trusted advisor, and we want to trust you, but we're going to check to make sure. Dr. Aubrey Daniels, we can change culture if we change behaviour. Remember we talked about the closeness between culture and values? I think that's really important. Airbnb, this is an entrepreneur guy. Company's culture is the foundation for future innovation. An entrepreneur's job is to build the foundation. Why is culture important to business? He says that here is a simple way to frame it. And I think this is really important, and it goes back to what I was saying earlier. The stronger the culture, the less corporate process a company needs. When the culture is strong, you can trust everyone to do the right thing. Do we think that's true? I think that will be a really good conversation to have in your internal audit team, perhaps at one of our team meetings. Do you think that's true in your organisation? I think in theory, if it was true, that would be a great message. I'm just maybe a little cynical there. And then Mark Parker at Nike, we have a culture where we're incredibly self-critical and we don't get comfortable with success. I think that's good. If you don't have trust inside your company, then you can't transfer it to your customers. Not quite sure why an American football quarterback would make that statement, except I guess he's part of a team and maybe he was thinking of it from a team perspective. And then the CEO of the Girl Scouts, culture does not change because we desire it to change. So we can't just write a report and say the culture needs to change. It changes when the organisation is transformed. The culture reflects the realities of people working together every day. So think about that in terms of what we've just been talking about ethics, about trust, about values, and how they link into the culture of your organisation. So an internal audit report that goes to board and to the audit committee and says, yeah, but the culture of the organisation is this, and it needs to change, isn't going to do it. People are going to have to take action in order to persuade it to change. So some closing thoughts. The internal audit profession is uniquely placed to embed principled decision-making into daily organisational practice. So part of what we do should encourage values, encourage ethical behaviours, and encourage the culture set by the board. Ethics, the heart of professionalism. So we as internal audit must make sure that we adhere to our code of ethics. Internal auditors need to demonstrate strong standards of integrity when advising leaders. You never ever want to be in the situation where you are talking to a senior manager in your organisation and they're about a particular issue and they say, yeah, but internal audit doesn't do that. That would be the worst possible scenario that you could be in. The implications of business decisions in order to create cultures of transparency and trust. Really important from us as internal auditors, and we need that culture within our internal audit function, a culture of transparency and trust. Do you trust your colleagues? Do they have your back? Do you trust them to deliver the best quality audit they possibly can and therefore raise the profile of internal audit within your organisation such that it becomes a known centre of excellence? That's what we need to strive to, but we also need to be brave enough to call out in our organisation where we see the wrong behaviours, the wrong culture, the culture that is driving the wrong behaviours. So we need to be clear about that as we move forward. So I have finished my thoughts, finished my sharing. As I said to you, we are going to put the webinar on our website, so you can share it with your teams, you can reflect, you can have another look. And I've allowed about 8 minutes, and we've got some questions, which is good. One of the questions is about a conflict. So the question is about their organisation has a code of ethics and the Institute of Internal Auditors has a code of ethics. As members of the Institute, there is an obligation on them to conform with the Institute's code of ethics. Which one is most important? Hopefully, my answer would be hopefully they don't conflict. A code of ethics is fairly generic. It talks about confidentiality, competence, objectivity, integrity. Some organisations will also have things like honesty in their code of ethics. I would seriously hope that there isn't a significant conflict here. But as professional career internal auditors, members of the Institute Internal Audit, you have an obligation to conform with our IIA Code of Ethics. Having said that, if there is something that concerns, then I think this is perhaps a conversation for the head of internal audit to have with the audit committee to call this out, because it may well be that actually we need to make some changes, not from an institute's perspective perhaps, but maybe your organisation needs to amend, update its code of ethics to make it more relevant for the world of 2019. So I think it's worth calling out if you've identified any issues. Another question about integrity. If internal audit identifies a regulatory breach, a fraud, or a financial irregularity, are we obliged to report it outside our organisation? Now, I think this is a really interesting one because I'm a great believer in internal audit encouraging the organisation to report themselves. So if you have an obligation to report to a regulator about a particular breach, then that's important that the organisation takes ownership of that. we as internal audit almost need to be the last port of call. If the organisation is very clear they won't report, then internal audit would have to step in. So I can give you an example of a local authority where I was working, and we had called in laptops. They'd been given to council members in a drive for paper efficiency, so minutes could be emailed out, etc., agendas. And we called them in to make sure they had all the right virus on them, etc. And we found one that had some inappropriate pictures on the laptop. So the laptop was confiscated. I went to see the CEO and pointed out to the CEO what we had identified. And her view initially was, oh, well, never mind, he's probably going to retire next year anyway, so it's probably not significant. And I pointed out that, you know, the pictures constituted a breach of law, a criminal act, and therefore there was an obligation on her to report this matter to the police. And she was, again, very reluctant. So I drew her attention to the fact that, you know, if the police found out through another manner, and she has no way of knowing what the police are investigating. If they came into the council, they would take every laptop, every server, every PC in the organisation, and then she would be tasked with running a business. She wouldn't be able to do that. So she picked up the phone and reported it. The gentleman went to prison and was forbidden from ever being a council member again, an elected official again. So sometimes we have to stand our ground. If she hadn't called them, I would have had no option but to call them. But I wanted ownership to be assigned to her very much. And finally, just because we've a couple of minutes left, one of the elements of the Code of Ethics is around competency. And it's quite difficult, isn't it, for us all to be competent on every single thing. So if we don't have the necessary skills, so perhaps something like culture, perhaps in your internal audit team you don't have anybody with experience of auditing culture previously, often the answer is, well, co-source. Go out, bring somebody in with expertise and pay them to do the audit. Hopefully there'll be an exchange of knowledge, and moving forward a member of your team would be able to pick this up. But can we not think about how we might be able to do this? Because cost constraints are on all of us every day. So how might we be able to move this forward ourselves? So think about things like the use of the internet. Think about networks, the Institute. We have technical guidance on how to audit culture. Is there anything that you could use there that would bring your competence level of your team up to help you deliver an audit in a particularly new area? So I guess what I'm saying is a message that we've already shared, which is think outside the box a bit. Think about where you might source information that would help you. Peer groups, sector groups. We have sector groups in the Institute, attending events, sharing information with colleagues. Think about all of those things in terms of helping you drive this forward. So those are our questions for today. There's my email there and a contact number. If you have any questions, any more questions, anything that the Institute can do to support you, please don't hesitate to contact us. So I'm 2 minutes early, I think, maybe 1 minute early. Thank you very much for all of you listening. I hope you found it helpful. I hope you found it thought-provoking. And I hope it's given you something to talk about with your team, with your colleagues, even perhaps with your audit committee. Have a good week, and not long before the weekend. Thank you very much.